Hello, my name is Taysha Williams, and I'm going to share this essay through a recorded presentation. After taking this course, the topic of climate justice really stuck out to me and made me think about all of the unjust in the world as it relates to climate change. I was particularly interested in how climate change affected different populations. So I studied articles that communicated the issue focusing on people living in poverty, Native Americans, people with disabilities, and women. Climate change is caused by the natural processes and changes in the pattern of weather, land surfaces, and ice sheets, and in oceans. It's defined as the statistical description of the state of the climate system. The Earth's climate is changing fast at a faster rate now than it has at any point over the course of history. This is cause for concern because global climate change has already affected people across the world that many researchers believe comes from the result of human activity. Anticipating population growth, we should all be concerned about how climate change can affect us individually and collectively. It's important for citizens across the world to be educated and knowledgeable about climate change and have access to the resources needed to be resilient against climate change events. Unfortunately, climate change affects people across the world differently, and many do not have access to resources and education to build resiliency. Climate justice defines how the impacts of climate change are not equal among people worldwide, including a difference between the rich and poor, men and women, healthy and the disabled, and younger and older generations. Climate change is happening now, and there's no country or population immune from it. The problem is not only that climate change affects people differently, but studies also show that people who are affected the worst are the least likely to be responsible for it. A stunning statement that was presented by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in a written article by Daisy Simmons stated that the poor and vulnerable are the first to suffer and the worst to be hit by climate change. Guterres states that victims of climate change are the most likely to have the lowest responsibility for it, causing the emissions responsible for a warming climate. To me, this just seems unfair. And I feel like there's so much literature out there about this topic, but I don't think citizens are aware of the amount of unjust that there is around climate change. It's essential to address climate justice inequities directly to ensure that long-term adaptation and mitigation strategies develop a better solution. Climate change also exacerbates social conditions and makes it more susceptible for vulnerable populations to be at risk for the highest exposure to climate change events. There's a lot of literature that communicates the issues of climate justice and the disproportionate effects on historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. So for this presentation, like I said, I looked at literature that focused on 4 different populations. 1, the disabled population. 2, Native Americans. 3, people living in poverty, and 4, women. So the first literature article that I reviewed to communicate the issue of climate inequities is an article titled, "How Climate Change Disproportionately Impacts Those with Disabilities." This article was published by the UN Environment Program. This article brings the concern of climate change events affecting people with disabilities are far greater than some other people. Climate emergencies such as fire, floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes, just to name a few, can affect disabled people more because they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they are most likely to have limited access to information and resources about the best way to respond to changes in the environment and climate emergencies. The United Nations flagship report on disability and development shows that disabled people are measuring behind in access to education. Education and access to knowledge empowers individuals to make decisions and provides them a better chance at surviving in critical emergencies. Another reason for disabled populations' vulnerability to climate change issues is their health conditions. Compromised health puts people with disabilities at a greater risk of infectious diseases contracted through climate change events. One example provided in the article showed that 155,000 people with disabilities were affected by the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina caused massive flooding, and people with limited mobility could not relocate to higher ground. This caused some of these individuals to drown and lose their lives, and others to obtain waterborne illnesses. The second literature review was conducted on an article titled Native Americans and Climate Change by author Julie Halbert. This article shares why Native Americans are among the most vulnerable population group in the United States. This was shocking to me. I had no idea. Native Americans collectively have about 95 million acres of tribal land, which provides challenges as they confront climate change. Extreme heat and drought affect plant development and growth and increase the mortality rate of wildlife, risk of wildfire, and habitat loss. Native Americans rely heavily on natural resources and benefit from plants and animals. Many of Native American reservations are home to very diverse habitats. Native Americans are also very protective over the Earth's natural resources and habitats. They believe that they were placed on this earth to protect it and be good stewards of their provided land. This is the belief that stems deep into the Native American heritage. One of the most controversial disputes that this article addressed was about climate issues and Native American land. It involved a nuclear plant that was proposed on the Green River in Utah. Native American tribes protested the Green River project because they feel that if a power plant caused damage to the river, the tribe would be displaced. The tribe wants to protect the river, and they understand that the river is the lifeblood of tens of millions of people. Native Americans have argued that they want to see solar panels on rooftops and not on Native American sacred sites. Native Americans have worked hard to preserve more land as we see an increase in warming climate. The third literature review I conducted was on an article titled Why Climate Change and Poverty is Linked by Joe McCarthy. This article was broken into several case studies that communicated how people affected by climate change were living in poverty, and that they're affected more severely during climate change emergencies. First case study took a look at Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico and became one of the deadliest hurricanes in American history. The poorest populations in Puerto Rico was hit the hardest and took the longest to recover. The wealthy people could leave the island or use their resources to rebuild after disaster. The poor people had to wait for assistance from underfunded relief efforts. This is the typical pattern for any climate-related emergencies within more impoverished populations. Climate change, such as droughts, can affect poor populations, especially in developing countries, affecting agriculture output. Developing countries rely heavily on agriculture as their primary source. A warming climate and natural disasters can devastate crop yields year over year. These countries have a lack of resources. Another case study reviewed in this article was the prolonged droughts in sub-Saharan Africa. Droughts have become more frequent and have caused crop failures, animal deaths, and food shortages. Developing countries such as Africa have had difficulty managing supply sources, let alone all the other complexities that climate change issues bring about. Air pollution is another climate change issue that affects the poor drastically. A case study of the ongoing forest fires in Australia shows that tens of thousands of people evacuated their homes. The people who were able to get out of the direct line of fire but did not have the resources to evacuate the entire area were affected by the intense pollution in the air from these fires. This article stated that it's estimated that 8.79 million people died prematurely each year due to air pollution. Air pollution also affects people who live in poverty because they tend to live closer together and in densely packed areas, close to industrial sites, and cannot afford air purifiers. Low-income and middle-income countries account for 92% of pollution-related deaths. The last population that I studied was women. And so an article by, again, Joe McCarthy stated why climate change disproportionately affects women. Going into this, I really couldn't understand how it could be different for men and women. And so what I found was very shocking to me. This article stated that women are more likely to live in poverty than men and have less access to human rights. They are also more susceptible to face systematic violence that escalates when social issues arise. As climate change intensifies, gender inequities become more prominent. Climate change issues and emergencies can lead to higher workloads for women, hazardous work environments, higher psychological and emotional stress, and higher death rates than men. Women are more likely to lead climate change initiatives and be advocates worldwide, but gender inequity with climate change can hinder their ability and potential for success. Women are typically in charge of running the household, which contributes to inequity of how climate disasters affect women differently than men. In a case study regarding Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, women were the ones that generally devoted hours of work to the recovery from damage. Women reported hanging soaked towels all day long, one after the other, carrying water containers into the kitchen and baths to collect rainwater, bathing the children in buckets, and washing the floor with collective rainwater. Women stated that it was exhausting and unfair to do all the work. In rural communities across the nation, women take care of the responsibilities of the household, including gathering food, water, household resources. I think I said across the nation, across the globe. As the effects of climate change gets worse and droughts and fire cause limited resources, women have to travel farther to obtain all of the resources that they need for their households. Gender-based violence is also another issue that is escalated when climate change issues are increasing. Like previously mentioned, climate change impacts the availability of resources, which causes environmental stressors. These stressors have been reported to fuel the increase in human trafficking and labor exploitation to harvest resources. In another case study in northeastern Nigeria, was done on terrorist group Boko Haram. This group targets vulnerable populations, such as women displaced from their land because of climate change, such as droughts. This study brings the issue to light that as the Earth's temperature is warming and the oceans are acidified, it's causing a decline in the fish population. Women who are dependent on fish to live are then forced to sell sex for food. This is a form of gender-based violence occurring due to climate change repercussions. Shocking. Climate-related displacement is also on the rise and mainly affects women. More women are displaced due to climate-related emergencies and can cause other gender-related violence to occur. Girls and women displaced by climate change have a hard time pursuing education and receiving economic opportunities. This article reports that refugee girls are less likely to have access to education than boys. Women and girls are face higher domestic violence, child marriage, and sexual violence, including human trafficking. The article I read states that in Malawi alone, climate justice issues can create 1.5 million child brides in the future. In conclusion, our daily lives are structured around climate change conditions. We are all accustomed to normal climate conditions for our area and have experienced unique weather patterns and abnormal climate events. But climate change affects people in numerous ways, including social, cultural, and natural resources. Climate change can affect our health, infrastructure and transportation systems, food and water and energy resources. Not only climate-related issues are created equal. Not all climate-related issues are created equal. And people from the more vulnerable populations are significantly affected more so than others, including people living in poverty, disabled people, Native American, and women, to say a few. It is essential to be a part of the conversation around climate change issues and the disproportionate effects on the different populations. To make societal impact and plan for adaptation and mitigation, we need to be intentional about how climate change affects the most vulnerable and how it limits to the effects. How can we help in this situation, especially US, who has the most resources? I loved an article titled Helping the Most Vulnerable Countries Adapt to Warming Climate by author Carrie Manlove. She states that the United States has a responsibility to aid and support the vulnerable countries. I love this article so much because since America is the world's leading producer of carbon emissions and the country with the most resources, we should be a part of the solution. We're part of the problem. So this article encouraged the United States to provide financial assistance to vulnerable countries. The author states that America should accept this responsibility and develop plans for aid to improve global resilience to climate change. Improving climate change resiliency in vulnerable countries will support additionally and help capacity building, infrastructure improvements, and economic growth. It can also foster agriculture growth, providing opportunities for clean energy access and help with poverty across the globe. Thank you for listening, and thank you for a great semester. I learned more than I ever thought I could about climate change, and I want to be a part of the solution. Thank you.